Why don't you start out by introducing yourself?
Hi, so my name is Stefan Prentice. I am an inspector with the Toronto Police Service. I've been with the service for about just a little over 25 years, and I'm currently assigned to the Office of the Chief.
Okay, so what does that mean, working in the office of the chief as an inspector? Because I think of inspectors as working in stations or heading up, the homicide squad or whatever, but you got a very specific role there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you're right that most inspectors are in charge of a unit and personnel in the field. My particular position at the moment is I'm the main liaison with the Office of the Chief and the Chief himself and the Toronto Police Services Board. So there's a lot of communication that goes back and forth between our board and the service, and I'm sort of the one in the middle of that, sort of helping negotiate that relationship.
Okay, wonderful.
So
Sorry, go ahead. Was there something else you wanted to add?
No, well, so we have a board meeting that occurs every 5 weeks. So a
Right.
big part of my job is the service bringing forward reports, and I help receive those reports and then make sure that they get over to the board. So that's a big part of my job.
A lot of people don't realize how much paperwork is involved in policing, and your current role is probably no exception to that. A different type of paperwork, I'm sure, from your investigative days. Okay, so let's
Sure.
go back, Stefan. I want to talk to you about little Stefan Prentice growing up. Are you from Ontario? Are you from the GTA? I think I recall from our previous conversations, but tell our viewers a little bit about your childhood.
So I was born in Windsor, and our family lived in a little town just outside of Windsor called Bell River, also home to Ty Domi, but we weren't there at the same time. And I was a very young lad when we moved when we moved to Grimsby. We lived in Grimsby for about 4 years. My parents are sort of serial movers. They like to buy houses, and then usually within about 3 or 4 years we move. My father's with the RCMP, as I know we talked about that before. So part of that was that he was in the RCMP moving around the GTA, but mostly it was just their own desire to move around Southern Ontario. So I moved around quite a bit, but really landing roots in Stony Creek for about 15 years before I went to university.
So, I mean, some of
It was
the
a
officers
wonderful
I've
little
been,
community.
yeah, some of the officers I've been speaking with in this campaign, quite a few actually, like had no intention of becoming a police officer when they were younger. They didn't have any police officers in their lives. You're somebody who, it wasn't just your father who was an RCMP officer, right? Didn't you had other officers in your family, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. So my father predominantly was the first police officer in our family that I'm aware of. My mother actually trained to be a police officer shortly after my father had joined. So, back in the early days, she would have been one of the first women to join the RCMP. Was trained, went to depot in Regina, and then when she graduated, they wanted to post her in Vancouver. So she decided rather than to uproot the entire family, that she would turn down that posting and eventually went to work for what's now Industry Canada, but at the time it was Consumer and Corporate Affairs Canada.
Mhm.
My dad's brother, my uncle, he was also an RCMP officer for a period of time, as well as I had some uncles with the Windsor Police Service. So yeah, policing did run deep in my family, but it wasn't this sort of draw from an early age that I wanted to be in policing, though, which is kind of interesting.
Hmm.
I mean, I played I played cops and robbers, and played with forensic kit that my father would bring home, but it wasn't this thing that I always wanted to be a police officer.
So then where did it come from? Like, at what point did things change for you, or did you have another plan altogether that you could tell us about? And did your path change at some point?
Yeah, I think for me, at a very very early age, my parents instilled uh, a degree of charity and empathy and community service in our upbringing. So a lot of what we did centered around those sorts of core values. And so as I grew up, I would volunteer at the bingo hall for church,
Mm.
or I trained as a lifeguard as a young person because I was always drawn towards service and helping people. I always had that deep desire in me. So I don't think really I thought about policing in that context until I got to university. So I went to university in London, and I took biology of all things. So it's completely related to policing. And
Why biology? So why
which is,
biology?
I think it was just a topic that I really enjoyed, and if you don't enjoy something, you won't do well at it. So I wasn't, a humanities person. I struggled to write essays in high school, but I was forced to write lab reports in university, which is essentially the same thing, just a different way of doing it. So I just really enjoyed the topic. Mathematics came very easy to me,
Hmm.
so I thought, well, why challenge yourself in something you don't enjoy doing? So at the end of the day, that's what I took in school. My brother, he took biology as well, so he's 2 years older, so I'm sure that had some influence as you look up to your older siblings and
Hmm.
see their path and say, oh yeah, I kind of like to do that, and
Yeah.
you have your own little support network as you go through school, right? So
But if I remember
um,
correctly, your biology brother ended up being a doctor, right?
yeah, he's
And
an
you ended up
anesthesiologist in Australia.
yeah, and you ended up being a police officer. So what was going on in your mind then? You're in school, you're writing up your lab reports, and does a light bulb just go on that, I want to write a different kind of report, police reports?
Actually, the two surprising things about policing that I found when I started was the sheer volume of report writing that you had to do, because I had no idea that was even involved in the job before I started. And the second thing was how much time I'd spend in the hospital. Those are two points that I had absolutely no awareness of, and mostly because my father was he was in sort of white collar crime,
Mm.
organized crime, wiretapping, things like that, where I was a street cop, and so I didn't have the street cop information in my background, I guess, if you could.
Right.
So there was a few things I was surprised at. Yeah,
So then what made
but
you what
like,
made you think about policing?
yeah. So I guess just as I was entering university, Hamilton Police and Halton Police were hiring, and my mom just turned to me and she said, "Hey, do you ever think about going into policing?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Well, no, I hadn't really, but yeah, sure, why not? I'll go give it a go." And so I wrote their test and I did their physical and I got interviews with both of them
Hmm.
at the ripe old age of 18 and
Wow.
probably 10 days. Like, I was very, very young. And
Wow.
I always laugh because the detective in Halton that interviewed me, or not Halton, in Hamilton, he looked at me, he goes, "How old are you?" And I said, "Well, 18, just turned." He goes, "Well, we're not hiring you. You're too young. But if you want to talk about the policing, I'll just sit here and talk with you." And I said, "Okay, sure." So we just sat there
Okay.
and had a chat for about an hour, and I'm like, "Okay, see you later. Have a good day." Like, I
That's
wasn't
really
like broken
cool.
or disappointed. Yeah,
Yeah.
it
How did
wasn't,
how did
and
that
I
chat
appreciated
go?
it, honesty.
Yeah, and just for
Really
him to
good.
sit with you for an hour, even knowing that he wasn't going to be getting a recruit here, like tell do you remember that chat? Do you remember it like sparking anything further in you?
No, no, not really. I mean, I had this conversation with him, and it was all just kind of a blur. You're sitting in a room that it was like on TV, like, was it Gary Miller, Glenn Miller, the old TV show where
Mhm.
they've got it's just rows of typewriters and detectives sitting there banging away at typewriters, and I'm just kind of taking it all in, and we're talking, and he clearly enjoyed his job. So,
Yeah.
I do remember that, but I don't remember the specifics of the conversation. But I do remember with Halton, the officer that interviewed me with Halton, it was a two-stage interview. So he gave me an interview, and then he recommended me for their panel hire.
Mm.
So it was, an inspector, a superintendent, probably their deputy chief, who sat down at a panel and interviewed me the second time. And I just wasn't getting good vibes from the
Mhm.
interview. And he called me afterwards and said, "Oh, you didn't get it." He goes, "But I don't know what happened." He goes, "It's so competitive. I don't put people through unless they're a lock." So he goes, "I
Mm.
thought you were going to get hired." And I
Wow.
said, "Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I guess I'll try again some other time." And that was kind of it. But an interesting fun fact about that guy, he was really a really nice guy. He had served in their emergency task force. I
Mm.
ran into him 20 years later because, fast forward, I was now a staff sergeant and I was in our SIU portfolio.
Mm.
And he comes walking through the front door of the police station, now working for the SIU. And he
Oh,
looked at me and we kind of locked eyes and, like, we remembered each other. And I said,
really?
I said, "Halton lost out."
Wow.
But
Yeah.
he said to me, he goes, "Oh, you were just too young." And I'm like, "Yeah, I totally get it. So that's
Yeah,
fine."
of
I
course.
wasn't, like, crushed. I wasn't crushed by it. So, it allowed me to go to university and get a degree and have
Yeah.
some wonderful experiences. I met my wife at university. So,
Mm.
for every door that closes, the windows all open up, right? So I wasn't terribly disappointed by all that. But suffice it to say that when I went to university, I kind of kept up in the service,
Mm.
the service side of things. So, I joined a fraternity, and a lot of the stuff we did at fraternity was community service work and charity work. I worked on a first aid team at
Mhm.
school. So I devoted a lot of time to that, which I really enjoyed. So that kind of almost kind of got me to thinking, oh, maybe I should be a paramedic, because I really liked helping people.
Mhm.
Uh, but then I thought, well, paramedics kind of do one thing, one job. They can be more trained, but essentially they're still doing sort of
Mhm.
patient care in the field. And then I started looking back to what my father had done, and he did some great things. Like he was able to guard the Pope. He
Mm.
was able to engage in really high level investigations. He went overseas twice, once to Africa and once to the former Yugoslavia, right when that area was experiencing challenges
Right.
in the mid 90s. And so I saw those deployments. And I thought, wow, what a varied career. And he's never had to go find a new job, and he's kept his seniority, and he's loved every minute of it. Like he was just called to do that job. And I thought, you know what, I feel like that's me. So, it was probably in my second year of university that I knew I had to be out of the office. I had to be interacting with people. Every day had to be a new day for
Mhm.
me, and that's really what sort of drew me to policing, and specifically to Toronto Police, because a lot of people say, well, why didn't you go to the RCMP?
Yeah, like your
And I
parents.
said, well, Regina's cold. I was not into that.
I know. It's true. But it's a
Right?
dry cold. It's a dry cold. I much
Oh,
prefer
okay.
it
Oh, is that
over
what they say?
Toronto, Ottawa. Yes.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So, I wanted to come back to Ontario. I wanted to stay in
Mhm.
the GTA. All our family was here. By then, my wife and I had been dating for quite some time, and I knew that she was the one. So, I wasn't going to uproot the family and kind of take us somewhere else in the country when I could satisfy everything that I wanted in Toronto.
Mhm.
And Toronto has a reputation. We are one of the biggest services. We are very diverse in terms of our membership, but also the kinds of investigations and the kind of police work we do. So, and we're very challenged. We there's a high degree of scrutiny in Toronto, and some people might look at that and say, well, that's a detractor. With me, I looked at it and I said, wow, if we're challenged this much on what we do, they must be really good at what they do. So I wanted to be a part of that.
Tell me about when
So
the challenging that you're talking about there. Are you referring to the scrutiny, the different levels of oversight, or what are you referring to exactly?
Well, I think scrutiny comes in a lot of different forms in Toronto specifically. Yeah, one is the oversight, which I think is necessary and actually works to our benefit,
Mhm.
because we've got outside agencies that come in and look at what we do,
Mhm.
and people can't say, well, it's just an old boys club, or it's just police protecting police.
Mhm.
We have outsiders that come in, have access to everything, because I've been intimately involved in those processes from the policing side. So I know that it's an open door and it's full cooperation. So I think that does come to our benefit.
Mhm.
The other thing is court. We come to court, and we provide testimony, and uh, Toronto's court system, like the court system operating in Toronto, it's a very challenging system. There's a lot of people involved, and there's some excellent lawyers
Mhm.
that work here, and when you go and give evidence, you can be challenged by some of the best legal minds in the country. And to have our investigations and our actions stand up to that, I think says a lot about our
Mhm.
members. And I'm
Mhm.
sure you've seen that through your career in homicide,
Mhm.
reporting on homicides, and just the amount of work that goes into preparation for that prosecution. Uh, Me personally, I've been giving testimony sometimes for 2 or 3 days,
Mhm.
on evidence, and I think that was an experience that I really enjoyed, because getting out there and doing the investigation, finding out who did it is sort of one part of the battle, but the
Mhm.
other part of the battle is making sure that you present the evidence in court in a way that's accepted by the court, and we're able to get a conviction. So I look at really it as two parts, and you got to be good at both.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point, and one that I've never heard raised in my conversations with police in Toronto, but it is so true. And maybe it's because I was always working in such a vacuum. Like I went to courthouses all over the GTA, but really I imagine it is much different, especially in some smaller centers, like where especially when you get those high profile cases, you know, you're probably going to get some pretty high profile lawyers involved and who have been around the block a few times and are really going to put your feet to the fire on certain things. You need to be prepared. That's such an interesting point, Stefan. Okay, so then you decide, you know, when you're in university, all right, I'm going to keep an eye on policing. And then do you apply for Toronto Police as soon as you graduate, or where does that go?
Well, no, at the time, in the mid 90s, had just come off of social contract and hiring moratoriums. I think it was Bob Ray government that was in at the time. And we just started, like the police services just started hiring in the year before I joined. And so you had this sort of pent up demand for jobs in policing and a lot of people applying. So you would have thousands upon thousands of people applying for jobs and not a whole lot of jobs because hiring was just starting to get going again. So you had to kind of apply to a bunch of different places just to make sure you couldn't put all your eggs in one basket. So even though I knew I wanted to apply to Toronto and to work for Toronto, I applied to a couple of other services, partly to make sure I had some practice with the interview. And it wasn't, my first interview was with the place I wanted to work. So I did apply to a couple of other jurisdictions that were in the GTA. And one of them, the interview didn't go very well. And I think it's just, I didn't connect with the interviewer for some reason. And maybe it was that I wasn't terribly invested in that particular service. So anyway, I kind of went through this hiring process where I applied to 2 or 3 places. And then Toronto was sort of the last place I applied, but I did it kind of all at the same time. And then Toronto was eventually the place that I ended up getting an offer from and started working for.
Your parents must have been very proud.
Excited.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they were. Oh yeah, my dad got to come to my graduation, and you know he presented me my badge. You know, because there are a lot of family connections in policing, and it's actually really good because it's like you come with a built-in support network. They know the demands of what the job is. What on your family, on your personal health, on your mental health. So you have this like little support network already sort of in place with police families that understand that, right? Because like I've always said, when I got my 20-year medal, I brought my wife down to make sure that she was there as part of it, and I dragged her up to get a photo with the chief because she earned it as much as I did because she had to deal with all the kids when I wasn't home. I missed birthdays, missed family events. Not even being able to get together with friends because they had a different schedule. And I know all of this probably resonates with you with your career, having to sort of be working some crazy hours and seeing some really crazy things. So
and my husband was the one that if we got a call in the middle of the day that one of our little ones had a fever and had to be picked up from daycare, he was the one 9 times out of 10 leaving his job and going to that. So absolutely, I have an appreciation for what you're saying. So when you graduated, where did you start out? What was your first posting in Toronto?
So my first posting was in 14 Division. So that's sort of the west end of Toronto, Parkdale, Bloor Lansdowne, the annex, Spadina Avenue is the border. So a really good mix of people down there. The times were a little bit different back then. Socioeconomically, it was an area that had a lot of street drug dealings, street prostitution, a lot of homelessness and addiction issues. So it was a very interesting place to work. But at the same time, there were a lot of like really good people, and I refer to them as like the stubborn downtown Toronto, demographic, because no matter how bad things around them were, they just would refuse to move. But that really did the city well because they also were there to call the police and provide evidence when things would happen on the street. Whereas if you didn't have that group of people, nobody would ever report it. You'd never be able to prove a case in court. So you really would be left spinning your wheels. So having a good group of people that lived downtown kept the city vibrant. And then eventually that whole area, I mean, I got promoted in 2010 and came back to that area. Not right in 14 Division, but I went to 11 Division. And I drove down into Parkdale and those areas. And I'm like, the rejuvenation that had gone on, I was amazed at how different it all looked. It was amazing. It was amazing.
So,
but working, go ahead.
No, you please continue.
No, so I was just going to say, working downtown really was an eye opener, because here I was, a suburban kid who's comes from a policing family, but not the kind of policing that occurs in municipalities. So I didn't have exposure to the people on the street, the extra roads that did have names. I was like, what are all these extra roads? And the
That didn't
laneways,
have
right?
names. They
Yeah,
didn't
the
have names.
laneways.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
you'd have to,
you
I'm in
take
the
that for
laneway that
granted.
goes, some of them, like the odd one did, but not really. Usually you were like, okay, I'm in a laneway between these two streets. It runs north and south, and I'm halfway up. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I am, right? Like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of interesting. My coach officer would drive me around because he knew where all the punch buggies were. So
Oh.
he'd drive me around and he'd punch me where there was a punch buggy. So
Oh, that
eventually I
brings
got
me
to,
back. The punch buggies of the 90s.
oh
Yes.
yeah. Oh no, and the punch buggies of the 2022s, because my wife still does it. And the new ones count as in her world, right? So yeah,
The new
it's
ones must
hilarious.
count for more because there's not nearly as many punch buggies now as there were back then.
Yeah, right.
That's
So eventually I
funny.
started to figure out where these were, and then he'd take me the back ways where I didn't recognize the area, and then he'd still get me. So
Yeah.
yeah, I got owned for about three months on the punch buggy
Oh, that's
front. But
awesome.
uh, I had I had some great experiences. I was trained by some really great people. The funny thing is, the guy who hired me and did my background investigation, he came to visit me at university, and he said, he was very like a lively, funny kind of guy. We have very similar personalities. And he says, okay, well, yeah, you know what? I could ride in a car with you for 10 hours, and your file is really good, and we think you'd be a good candidate. And I'd work with you if I was forced to work with you. So he goes, that's kind of like the last test, is would I work in a car with you for 10 hours? And he says, yes. So he says, I'll recommend you for hire. So anyway, fast forward 6 months, and I do my training, and I come back, and sitting on parade on platoon is this guy. And
Wow.
he has the same first name as me, spelled the same way, which is extremely rare.
No way.
And I worked with him for my first 5 weeks. So it was him and
Wow.
I just having a great old time. He bought me a coffee. He said, I'm going to buy you a coffee, but this is the first and only one I'm going to buy you.
Yep.
So but he showed me, he was really good. He really showed me how to treat people. And
Mm,
I think it was really like a good start to my career, is having people that you worked with that showed you, how a police officer is supposed to approach their work, because it can be really demanding and taxing mentally on you. And you can develop these biases just from what you're exposed to every day. And you constantly have to kind of remind yourself, this person who's standing in front of you that has an addiction issue or a mental health issue, has a mom, a dad, a family, had hopes and dreams at one point, still has hopes and dreams,
mm,
but they're just in a situation right now. So I got that, so I always had that.
mm,
But then when I got hired as a police officer, I worked with people that had that, in spite of what they saw and what they dealt with every day. And I
mm.
thought that was very, very important, uh, that to draw my attention to that in my new job, because it could very easily just kind of look at the person as less than a person.
Mhm.
And it's not the case. And you have to fight against that. You really have to put an effort in against that. So I took those lessons to heart, and eventually I started training people, and I trained a lot of people. Uh, I didn't have a lot of service as a policeman when I started doing that. I had about 3 years service, so
Mm.
I could show them technically what the job was and how to perform it. Well, I wasn't the best cop. There were other people that were just really great cops,
Mhm.
good street smarts. I was sort of handicapped by my upbringing in suburban, and then going to university. I didn't have that sort of
Mhm.
street, you know,
Mhm.
accoutrement that
Cred. You
some
didn't have the
had.
street cred.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's some people, they could just sniff it out. Like they
Yep.
would find things, and I'm like, how did you do that? Like, but one thing I did instill on my the people I trained was, how to be empathetic, and how to always treat people with respect and like a person, because that's how they deserve to be treated. And to always really look at somebody like they could be your brother, sister, mother, brother, and treat them like that, and you'll never go wrong. Because I've had family members that have been involved in different things, and you're glad to hear that when they had to call for service, that they were treated that way, or the way that you would expect. To remind yourself of that, but also train those around you to do that.
So I want to drill into that a little bit more, Stefan, because you mentioned a moment ago that, you had the empathy before you got into policing. but then you really it was good to be able to remind yourself of it when you got into policing. So just drive home that point for me. What changes when you get into policing? Is it because I mean, some of the other conversations that I've already had in this very campaign, you know, we talked a lot about all the negative things that you guys are exposed to, and that especially when your primary response, it can just be one after the other after the other. What does that do to you if you aren't keeping your empathy in check? If you're not, you know, continuing to look at these people as they are, what can happen?
Well, I think really what can happen is you can get desensitized, and you almost are firewalling yourself away from being hurt. So I know that you know, I don't have any, you know, I don't have a background in you know, mental health or psychology or medicine or anything, but just as like a layperson's view to this, I think that we try to protect ourselves from the mental rigors of our work. But part of doing that, you almost have to desensitize yourself to the humanity that's in front of you in a way, and almost dissociate yourself with the fact that the person that's in front of you is a person in some respects, not all the time and not to any great extent,
Mhm.
but you know, we call it our dark humor. So things that people would look at us like, oh my God, how do you find that funny? Or how can you joke at a time like this?
Mhm.
But for us, it's about that's our way of sort of mentally coping.
Mhm.
Um, an interesting thing I noticed is I went to see the movie Black Hawk Down, and they're in this huge firefight, and I'm in a theater with my wife, and it's a really stressful part of the movie because everything's going crazy. There's bullets flying, and then all of a sudden it goes quiet, and these two machine gunners are left behind, and they've got to go find their squad. So they go to find their squad, and one of the guys trips and falls, and I am howling at the top of my
Mhm.
lungs because I think it's just the funniest thing, and I'm the only one in the theater laughing, and I'm like, is there something wrong with me that I find that funny that
Mhm.
they're in this crazy situation, life threatening, they could die at any moment, but he trips and falls, and I think that's funny, you
Yeah.
know. So you know, that's just like a very small example, I think, where I think there are times throughout our career too where we react a certain way, and then will actually talk with each other about it and say, you know what, the fact that we're reacting this way is actually really bad because most people would react a completely different way to
Mhm.
what they're seeing. And you know,
But
I think
most
it's
people
just
don't see that stuff all the time. Most people don't
no,
are responding to those calls over and over again. So, like you saying, laughing during that scene in Black Hawk Down, I mean, in journalism, we've got the same dark humor. And if some people heard some of the conversations they'd think that we're awful people. But really, it's a protection mechanism because sometimes all you can do is laugh because if you don't laugh in that moment, then all you can do is cry, you know,
cry,
and
yeah,
and if you're crying, you can't do your job. You cannot keep going. You need to laugh so that you
yeah.
can keep taking step forward, step forward, step forward, right?
Yeah, and I think the important part is, you know, you ground yourself after the fact. Either you talk to your platoon mates or your partner afterwards, and you can have a little bit more of a real conversation about what you saw. You come home, you talk to your family member, you talk to your wives, your friend, your wife, your friend, your spouse, whoever it is that's in your life, your significant other, and you kind of just make sure you ground yourself. Like, so I mean, I never really took the job home where I would regale my family with stories. I actually shared very little, but I did talk about, you know, some of the harder moments and like how I felt in those moments to,
Mm.
you know, kind of just to kind of say it out loud to somebody else that yeah, that was impactful. um, you know, because the thing is, like, let's say for instance you go to give somebody a traffic ticket, you know, how, you're doing something that somebody would see as you're putting yourself in conflict or something that's not nice. So in a way, that's like sort of the first little scratch at I realize that you're a person, but I've got to do this anyway. It's my job, and
Yes.
I'm trying to affect community safety and public safety. Then the next one is, you know, somebody gets severely injured, and then perhaps somebody dies, and you're standing there after somebody's died, and you're like like you said, you either laugh or you cry. Now you're not standing over a person who's died laughing, but you're certainly impacted by that, and you can't just sit there and sort of in your own mind think about what was this person doing. Yes, maybe they were involved in criminal activity, but one thing I've learned is somebody who's involved in criminal activity isn't only involved in criminal activity. They may be their father,
Mm.
they're a member of their community, the member of their family. I worked for a period of time with Corrections Canada, and
Mm.
so for that 3 years, I helped parole officers manage some of the highest risk offenders that really were not on a dangerous offender status.
Hmm.
So basically, the most dangerous people you'd ever consider letting out on some kind of release. And I'd help kind of manage with these people, and they lived in a halfway house. And you'd see them, a lot of them, their families would come and visit. They talk to them. You'd see them interacting with their kids, and you're like, they're kind of just being a dad. They make awful choices and they do awful things, and sometimes in the moment they get carried away, but they still do have another side to them, as much as you want to think they're bad. And when we do our investigations, sometimes we got to close that part out to say, I can't really consider that right now. I have to just take me where the evidence leads, and do what I need to do in order to do my job effectively.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that balance, because you're clearly such an empathetic guy, and it's not to say that most police officers aren't, but balancing that empathy with the job in front of you of the good guys and the bad guys, like the cops and robbers, where the criminal code is saying you have to arrest somebody for this. Was that difficult for you as somebody who, I know you grew up wanting to do a life of service, but really wanting to help people. Was it difficult for you knowing the other side of things, but having to enforce the law? Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm not, but do you get what I'm getting at? Because that must be a tricky
Yeah.
balance, for not just for you, but for any officer.
Yeah, no, I think what the way we balance that is we think about the rights and desires and the service we provide to the person that is impacted by the other person's actions. So you're called to serve, and I empathize with the person who was broken into, or whose car was damaged, or the person who was stabbed. So you really think about protecting that person, but also protecting the next person, the next potential person. So when you're kind of doing the math in your mind and you're balancing the two sides of the equation, for me, where I end up with is, I'm going to do what I have to do my job effectively, so that the other side of the equation isn't impacted any more than it has to be. But then I balance the offender and say, well, just because you've done this doesn't mean I'm going to treat you poorly, or doesn't mean I'm going to trample your rights, or abuse you, or abuse the process, or even talk to you in a manner that's disrespectful, because you're still a person, and I still have empathy with the fact that you're still a person. But I don't have empathy for what you've done. So I don't accept your behavior, but I accept the fact that you're still a person. So I think that that's the part that we always have to kind of continually remind ourselves of, is just, you are still a person, regardless of all the bad things that you've done. You're still a person, and we're going to treat you with that respect.
Humanely, professionally.
So yeah, exactly. And then if you layer in, people that have mental health challenges, it requires you to go even a step further, because now you've really got to really engage in a lot of patience, a lot of communication. You can't rush. So for me, when I was parading prisoners who would come into my station when I was a staff sergeant, you could tell right away when somebody was in crisis, and whether that was a result of an addictions issue, or mental health challenge, or something else. It could have just been that they are in sensory overload because of the situation that they're in. You really had to take your time to communicate with people, to make sure that they understood what was happening, and really be patient. That's the key in all this. And that's something I can say that I've seen over the last 25 years to a really, really great extent, is the patience that our members exhibit in challenging circumstances. That's something that 25 years ago, if you had somebody who was acting out, it was like, what are we standing around for? Let's grab this person. We've got other radio calls to do. Let's get them to the hospital, or get them to the jail, whatever it is that we need to do to wrap this situation up right now. And we also didn't have a lot of tools, things like conducted energy weapons, or other less lethal force options. So we were really left with only a few options in terms of escalating force options. Now we have officers have all those options, but then they also we've really been drilling and training de-escalation and patience in talking to people, so there's not that need to resolve somebody in crisis as quickly as possible. If you
Mhm.
want to take all day, we'll take all day, because at the end of the day, nobody wins in a fight, and that's not what we're here for.
Mhm.
People, when I first got hired, they used to think, oh, you're going to get in fights all the time. And I'm like, I don't plan on getting any fights. I had been in like 2 fights when I was growing up. And I'm like, that's not me. I don't want to get in fights. I mean, I'll protect myself and others if I have to. That's, something you sign up for, but I'm not looking for it, because the first time I got in a fight when I was in grade school, I told you I got bullied a lot when I was in grade school. I ended up hurting my hand, and I'm like, I don't want to hurt my hand. So, why get in a fight? So that was another thing. You talk about why I got into policing, standing up for the little person, the people that can't stand up for themselves. That was a big part of it too. Uh, having been bullied, in grade school, I think that really instilled in me a desire to stand up for people who can't necessarily stand up for themselves.
Mhm.
Whether it's just in the moment to talk, or if physically getting in between two people, or somebody from getting taken advantage of financially, from through fraud, things like that. So really, that was another big part of how I came to policing.
And do you feel like the career has fulfilled that for you? Do you feel like, you've been able to serve the community in the way that you've wanted to? Does it fulfill you in that way?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I truly do. I think that for me, I don't have to look for positive feedback that I've made a difference. It's nice when you get it, where you run into somebody and say you really like had an impact on me. Um, so it would be nice to have that, but quite often it's not something that's readily given or seen, just because of the nature of the work that we do. Sometimes you do get it, and it's really wonderful when you do. I've actually found that that feedback I've gotten more from other officers that I've worked with, than people out in the community. Officers that have come to me and said that I made a difference in their work, in their work environment, or how I treated them in different scenarios. And to me, I think that especially when I was in positions of leadership,
Mm.
uh, have really made a difference. A little bit of positive reinforcement that kind of what I was doing at that time in that moment was right, and had an impact. I
So
think
talk to
it's
me, talk to me about that a little bit, because you started as a constable in 14 division, and then did you get promoted out of 14, or where did you go from there? Like, tell me how you rose through to where you are now as an inspector.
yeah. So my first promotion, actually, after I left 14 division, I went to our a unit called their community oriented response unit, a core unit. I was there for a short period of time, but then I went into our drug unit, and I worked for 3 years in our drug unit, and then as I told you, I moved for 3 years into our on a secondment to Corrections Canada. So
Mhm.
after I left that secondment, I was promoted to sergeant, and I went to 11 division, and I was fortunate to have. There's some really great people that I worked with there. I had a good unit commander at that job, and so I really moved around within the division, working in criminal investigations and major crime. I got the opportunity to continue to work in some undercover projects.
Mm.
Not as an undercover officer, I did a little bit of that work when I was in drugs, but I wasn't terribly good at it. So I was good at writing warrants and doing surveillance and writing operational plans. So uh, I was fortunate enough I got to work on a couple of homicide projects while I was there, just from the undercover aspect,
Mm.
which was great, because I got to stay sort of in touch with that side of policing. And then from 11 division, I was a sergeant for about 4 years, and then I got promoted to staff sergeant, and went to 13 division.
Mm.
Uh, the 13th division was nice. It was a kind of a small station,
Mhm.
and I had a platoon of officers that I supervised there for about 2 years, and then I went to our professional standards unit, where I worked on our special investigations unit liaison. So
Mhm.
anytime the special investigations unit was called to a scenario, a situation, I would come and sort of manage the services response to the SIU incident, making sure that processes and procedures were being followed. I was the main conduit to the SIU for information, so I would gather and collect evidence. Sorry, I would gather and identify evidence, and
Mm.
and give it to them, or point it out to them
Mhm.
where they would find it, and then really make sure that they were able to do their jobs unfettered. And then afterwards, I would write the investigative reports that uh, sort of looked at the policies, procedures, and did we follow them? Are there lessons to be learned?
Mm.
So I did those administrative investigations and reported those after the fact.
Hmm.
So that actually part of it kind of really is what gave me the foundation for the job that I'm doing now, because I wrote a lot of reports to our board reporting
Mhm.
these SIU incidents, because we're obligated to do that by law. So
Yeah, I wanted to
yeah.
touch on that because I wanted to sort of launch off that to get into the whole strip search stuff. Tell me about your work on that file. And because I think this is something that you are or should be quite proud of, because it's made a big difference.
Oh yeah, I'm extremely proud of that particular piece of work. When I was doing the SIU job, I got a call from a friend of mine, Kim O'Toole. She's a superintendent with the service now, but at the time she was also a staff sergeant, and she'd been given a project to work on a full body scanner. And so these are airport-like scanning machines, except the difference being that these used X-rays,
Hmm.
so they would actually penetrate your body completely to do a search. And so we were looking at that piece of technology as a way to reduce the number of people we would strip search. So we did a pilot in 14 divisions. Excuse me one second.
Mhm.
Sorry, I got a little excited there and
No, we're
knocked it right out of my ear.
yes.
So that yeah. So what we would do is, when somebody would come into the station, instead of strip searching them, we would do our frisk search, and then we'd put them on an X-ray machine and we'd scan them. And then we wouldn't have to do the strip search afterwards, because we were confident that the scanner would find anything that we needed to remove from the person for safety reasons.
Hmm.
And we also thought that that would be, it would be better for the person being searched, because it's quite it's not a humane process to have somebody take off all of their clothes in front of two other people. I mean, it's not any fun for the people doing the search, I can tell you that. It's not something that people want to do. They kind of do it because it's their job. So that particular piece of work, when we brought it to our police service board, at the same time, the OIPRD had written a report called Breaking the Golden Rule. And
Hmm.
that was an examination of strip searches throughout Ontario. And it was quite an unblemished view of strip searching in Ontario, and specifically Toronto, we were doing a lot of strip searches, probably somewhere in the magnitude of 14,000 strip searches a year.
Hmm.
And it was an opportunity for us to really look at those searches to say, are we providing the best service possible to the community in a way that is acceptable? And so we undertook, we sort of stopped the body scanner project and immediately started a review of our strip search policy. And we did that for a period of about 8 months, where we did a review. And it wasn't all just looking at what were we doing. It was really, we took a very short period of time to look at what were we doing and where did we need to go.
Mhm.
And so we changed our governance. We updated our governance around searches. We provided substantial amount of training to our members around searches. We instituted some new data collection tools that really helped us understand what we were doing in those strip search decisions, and then what we were finding as a result. So we, working with our records. So we really kind of took a very wholesome view of what was happening in our search rooms and with our decision makers, to really understand that what was happening. And once we did that, we really just sort of instituted an entire suite of changes that where we also added an accountability feature to them, where we were reviewing strip searches and making sure that people were following the new processes. We were capturing all the data we need to capture. So I think for about a year and a half, I looked at every single strip search in the service that we had done, to really just to do my own quality control, make sure we were, hitting the mark, and we were had a lot of conversations with people out in the stations. But at the end of the day, I think what the result of this is the people in the field, they really wanted to do what was right. Like, they didn't want to see anybody getting hurt in our cells. whether that's the prisoner themselves,
Mhm.
or officers or members who were dealing with those people, or even people down the line in the courthouses that include the
Mm.
judges, lawyers, court staff. So because it all started with their arrest, and they wanted to make sure that nobody in that whole line of people ever got hurt because something they did or didn't do. So they really sort of defaulted to, well, I'm just not going to take any chances and I'm going to search this person just to make sure. So it was really born out of good intentions. But I think that once we really sort of brought the training in, we brought some extra technology pieces, so a magnetic wand, like
Mhm.
what you see when you go into a courthouse, they
Mhm.
wand you. So we introduced that as well. And I think we gave them the confidence to understand where their real risk is and how to go about their searches and not have to necessarily do a strip search.
Mm.
And so our strip searches went from on the order of 14,000 to about 700 and something in 2021. So
Wow.
really had a major impact on searches. But really, I mean, I don't take, I mean, it takes a small amount of credit for that. And just in that I was part of the team, the small team that
Mhm.
looked at that, examined it, put a bit of a path in place. The chief, he really took a hold of searches, and he really pushed and made it a priority for the service, which made our jobs very, very easy. But at
Mm.
the end of the day, it was all those individual decision makers out in the field that really adopted the training, adopted the thought process, and actually put it into practice.
Mhm.
The credit really is their credit, that they got on board and affected that change. Because I could sit there and tell you do this, this, and this, and I
Mm.
could talk till I'm blue in the face. But until the person believes it and understands it for themselves, nothing will change.
Mhm.
So really, like that was, I think, a really big eye opener for me, and the first real exercise in change management across an entire service that I was exposed to. And
Mm.
it was an amazing learning opportunity for me. I learned a lot about myself, the organization, and how we function, all the little pieces. And it's experience that I draw into this very day.
Mhm.
You know, when I look at what we do and how we do it, because I have little areas where I can have influence, or I can have an opinion, uh, say at a command meeting, or with the chief, or with the chief's executive officer. I can impart some of what I've learned into those conversations.
Mhm.
And I'm fortunate to be in a position right now where I've been able to do that.
It's interesting to hear about how much thought and work, um, and collaboration goes into changing what could be seen as just one little simple thing, that has been done in a certain way because it's always been done that way. We continue doing things because it's just one of the policies, the procedures, whatever that we've just always done. But then the difference that can make, like you said, the officers don't enjoy doing those things, but also the human dignity part for the person who is being searched. I imagine that, I mean, the hope would be that would, help improve relations between the community and police, like just changing that one thing that it would signal change, because the police service has been changing. I mean, the police service it's got to be such a different place now than when you started more than 2 decades ago.
Oh, of course. I mean, I think with anything, there's generations that come through policing, and every generation looks substantially different than the generation before.
Hmm.
Just because standards are changing, expectations are changing. There's new laws. There's new politics around policing, and the way in which we do things. And really, that's just an expression of the community telling us this is how we want to be policed. This
Hmm.
is what our policing needs to look like. Because if you don't have that, that community trust, that community acquiescence to policing, then nothing happens. They won't, like, we're self-police societies. I mean, we have one police officer for, I don't know, something like 650 people in Toronto. So those 650 people are going to do whatever they want to do. We're, yes, an accountability piece that performs a function in society, but essentially people are going to do what they want to do.
Hmm.
So we have to be mindful of that, and listening to the community the way we've been doing it now, that real collaboration with our communities, not just a token, here's what we're going to do, what do you think, and then we just go and do what we're going to do anyway. uh, that's an old system, that's an old model, it's an old way of thinking. I think we tried to do that, or wanted to do that to a certain extent, but really we weren't listening. And
Hmm.
now we're in a period of time where the community's expectation is true, real collaboration where they actually have a real say in how something is done, and and brings that into policing. Because I'm a police officer, and when I do something or I write a report, it's from a police officer's lens. Yes, I'm a community member. Yes, I do all of these things outside of policing, but the way I view something is colored by my policing experience. So it takes somebody from the community to say, you're going to say and you're going to do it and you're going to do it that way.
Mm.
That's landing flat with me. I don't like that. And here's the 15 reasons why. And
Mm.
I have to be open enough to say, okay, I'm going to check my ego and pride to think that I know everything and say, yeah, tell me what it is that we need to be doing so we can do it better.
Mm.
And a good example of that is our missing and missed.
Mm.
We have Justice Epstein's report that has a lot of recommendations, but those recommendations aren't, they're not just check boxes where we're just saying, yeah, we did that check. Yeah, we did that check. There is a whole layer of community involvement and community collaboration within that allows us to really affect meaningful change so that we actually affect outcomes as opposed to just implementing recommendations on a report and the outcome doesn't necessarily change when we're
Mhm.
really trying to change outcomes. And I think that's really important. And so that brings me back to strip searches. The idea was to affect an outcome, not just reduce an overall number. That was part of it, but the outcome was like what you said: give people some dignity back, police the way the community is telling us they want to be policed. They wrote an entire report about it through the OIPRD to tell us that.
Mhm.
So we had to we have to listen. That's our obligation. That's part of our role, is to listen to that, because if we don't, then we're ineffective.
Yeah, I think that there's historically been a thought, and not just with police, but with any government funded agency, that if a report, thousands of dollars are spent on, tens of thousands of dollars sometimes are spent on a report and putting together recommendations, and then that report just sits on the shelf. So from what I'm hearing from you, though, it seems that something that has changed really in policing since the time you have started is that it's not just about the report. It's not just about checking them off. It's about the fact that officers actually want change too, and are recognizing that that change can't always come from within, that you need to be able to hear, because as you touched on earlier in the conversation, just by virtue of your job of responding to 911 call after 911 call, for example, if you're in primary response, like you're cognizant of what sort of impact that can have on you, and the different biases and how that can shape your view of the world. And it sounds like you've been somebody who's been very good at keeping that in check. I've talked to other officers who have told me that, sort of one day they just realized, like, hey, I don't like the person that I am when I come home, and I got to figure out better how to deal with these things. It sounds like that comes from a few things: your upbringing, your coach officer when you first started on. Was there anything else, do you think, that has shaped your view of things? Because like you mentioned to me in the conversation we had a couple weeks ago, that you've been involved in some very stressful events as a police officer. You've had guns pulled on you. Like you've experienced things that would, I think, be understandable in terms of making you have like a darker view of the world, or just put your police hat on and go to work, do your job, and to make you angry, but you still have this very level-headedness to you, and empathy that really comes through in everything you say.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got it, I don't know if I took the magic blue pill before, I started policing, or if it was just, I never wanted to change. Like, I wanted to always be who I was, at the end of my career that I was at the beginning. At least in terms of my personality, my view of the world. I've always got this sort of, uh, happiness, I guess you could say, about my approach to life. Bad things will happen, and I'll just say, okay, but something bad happened, and I gotta, I'll move on, and the world will still turn, and something good will happen. Just keep that sort of good karma, good Zen going, because eventually the universe will pay you back. I'm a big believer in you are where you're meant to be, and but if you do negative things or think negatively, you're going to end up somewhere negative. And
Mm.
I always just try to keep things positive, and I surround myself with people that are positive, and I always just try to keep that viewpoint. Now, that's not to say that something I've seen or experienced in my career won't, catch up to me in some way, or maybe not now, maybe not in the future. That's always possible, because I don't think there's no rhyme or reason, it seems to me, to any of that. But I think definitely being grounded, I
Mhm.
think, is just at least one of the things that you can do, to keep your health, your mental health, especially. I know that we talked a little bit about my father's deployment to Yugoslavia,
Mhm.
and when he came back from that, he had changed. He was a little bit different, but back then there was no talk about, road to mental readiness,
Mhm.
or talking things through when you got back, or check-ins, or supervisors making sure they were mindful of your wellness. Like none of that was not even in our vocabulary. And so one day he's in a building and he gets vertigo, and the building, and this is years later, the building is moving on him. And I said, and nobody, we were all sort of dumbfounded by that. And at the time, there was some reporting on chemicals that were in bunker sandbags with the U.S. and the
Mhm.
Canadian military. There was like a bit of a story around that, so they were kind of testing him for exposure to harmful chemicals and things like that. But what I realized is that his experience in Africa before that, he talked a lot about his experiences because it was very positive.
Mhm.
The families that he interacted, the travel. When he came back from Yugoslavia, he didn't talk so much about his experiences. I got very few stories from him. One of them I know was he was part of the civilian monitor, so he's with another police officer. They go to a house for a domestic dispute, and somebody stepped in front of his car with an AK-47 and started spraying the car and over top of the car with AK-47 rounds. And he's in the passenger seat, and his partner who's driving froze. And so my dad's punching him basically to say,
Go.
back the car, move, go, get out of here. And so I can only think that that feeling of helplessness
Mm.
in that life or death scenario, how does that not impact you
Mhm.
somehow? Uh,
Mhm.
but to kind of go through that and some other things, I know that he was investigating, some black market sales through the military, so that put him into some precarious positions. But
Mhm.
again, he never really talked about it. But I know he was impacted by that.
Mhm.
So I'm very mindful of mental health, and the toll that it can take on people. And maybe my experience has been different because I've been exposed to municipal policing, which puts you into a space gradually, whereas he was not exposed to that and then all of a sudden was exposed to it. Maybe that had something to do with it.
Mhm.
I don't know, but thankfully he's a lot better. He's better now, but at the time, yeah, I know that he had his struggles with
Mm.
some of that stuff. So I'm glad that he's well now. But a good visceral example of, if you don't make things a priority, they can, or at least even if you don't know about them, you got to kind of bring them, make them top of mind. Otherwise, they could sneak up on you, and then you're
Mhm.
then you're in real trouble.
Mhm.
Because then
And
you start, having troubles with your job, trouble with your family, all your support systems start evaporating on you, and then you end up in a scenario where, potentially, I can't even imagine people who maybe died by suicide had these struggles and then had their supports fall away from them, and then they're left sort of in this deep pit of despair. And it's troubling to know that that happens for people.
Mhm. If there was like a lesson that you could tell your younger self going into policing, aside from you're going to have to do a lot of paperwork, a lot more than you think, um, what do you think that the advice would be that you would give to your younger self? You've been the beneficiary of many, pieces of good advice from your mentors and stuff along the way. But is there anything that you would add or that you'd want to make sure that your younger self knows? Anything that you tell young recruits now?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Yeah, I think that the advice that I would give is just never lose sight of who you are. It's almost like write yourself a letter to yourself before you start, to say, this is who I am. This is what's important to me. This is what I believe in. This is why I'm joining, and how I am going to do my job. And then, at the 10-year mark, open it up and just like, am I on track? And if I'm not on track, then you have a chance to course correct.
Mhm.
Really listen to the people around you, especially the ones that care about you, but also the ones that really set a good example in policing. Be open to the feedback. You can't be arrogant or uh, or um, or be full of hubris
Mm,
around yourself as a police officer. You have to constantly be looking for ways to do things better, to be better, and sometimes that takes a hard look at yourself and what you're doing and what your attitude is on something. It takes a lot for people. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've had my share of struggles in work and personally, and it's not until you examine yourself to say, I'm part of the problem here. I need to fix myself and do something differently if I want to see things around me change.
mm,
You know, that's a hard thing to do as a person, is to kind of deconstruct yourself or have somebody else deconstruct you,
mhm,
and you kind of lose. That is not the vision I had of myself
mhm, mhm.
in this situation, and but taking that as a catalyst for change in yourself, and just be open to changing yourself. That's all I would say. Be open to the fact that you're wrong. Be open to the fact that there's a better way. Be open to the fact that you don't know everything. We're all just trying to do the best we can with the information we've got, but there's always a way to do it better, and just be open to that.
Are
I
you
think that that
comfortable
would be.
expanding on that? Like on any lessons that you've learned where maybe you thought doing something a certain way or was the right way, and then you came around to the idea that it wasn't, or I got to change this part of me because this isn't working.
I'd say probably most of that isn't job related. Is more in my personal life.
Mm.
My wife and I have been married for almost 25 years or
Mm.
25 years, or almost 25 years.
Oh,
Oh
are
my
you gonna
God,
get in
you tested.
trouble?
You tested. I don't know. I'm not gonna let her watch this. No, but uh, so the one thing is, being married that long, is that your relationship changes, it evolves, it grows, it matures. But your spouse is the person who's going to tell you like it is.
Mm,
And if you're not doing something right, or if you're uh, on a wrong path, they're the ones that are going to put you and tell you the honest truth.
mhm,
And you have to be open to that. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I can tell you the first thing, if I'm gonna when my kids get married, the first thing I will tell them is, check your ego in your
mhm,
marriage. You are not going to win. It's not about winning. It's not about losing. You have to be open to saying, that's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm going to do better and try to change. You could do that in your professional life too.
mhm,
You can approach a situation, say, I did that wrong. I could have done it better. I'm really sorry, and I'm going to move on. I say sorry all the time. I
mhm,
think it's just so important to acknowledge when you've done something wrong, to move forward.
mhm,
And I've done that in my professional career as well as in my private life. So I think that that's something really, really important. Don't dig your heels in.
mhm,
Admit when you've done wrong, and then
mhm,
the process to doing it better can start. Right?
mhm. As a very stubborn person, my husband would say that I'm a very stubborn person. I've got to say, I completely agree with you. The power of saying sorry, not just for the person that you're apologizing to, but for yourself, to be able to bring yourself back down to earth and like, yeah, I was wrong. Like I get into some heated arguments with people, and but I always like to hear the other side, and if somebody can convince me, like it's a humbling feeling, but it's a good feeling, right? Because you're learning something and you're moving forward in that moment. You don't want to ever be stuck in that place where you're just wrong.
Oh yeah, and then yeah, it sucks. You're sitting there eating crow because you said or
Yeah.
done something, and in your own mind, you're talking to yourself, and you're like, I know I did wrong, but I'm digging my heels in because I can't show
Yeah.
weakness,
No
right? And you're
fun.
like, okay, I'm stopping. Get off the train tracks. New
Yes.
path, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I asked you about what you would tell your younger self. What about, I mean, we've talked about a whole bunch of other things. What about what you would tell members of the community? Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want the public to know, either about you, Stefan Prentice, or your fellow officers, policing in general? What message you want to get across to them in this conversation?
Yeah, I think that the one message that I would get across is get to know us. Don't just listen to what other people might think or say, or an experience that they think they might have had, or read a news article, or a television story. Those are all important, but I think the real importance is get to know us, because you will find that um, police officers are engaging, they care, they will go out of their way to help you. They are they're in it for the right reasons to serve. There are those that are not, but I think that they are a very, very small minority. And when we find them, we do our best to correct that behavior. But get to know us. I think that it's really, really important. Tell us, talk to us about current events, what's happening in your neighborhood, and I think you'll find that that conversation will be appreciated and reciprocated by members. I'll tell you, one of the biggest things I always got when I take my son to hockey, or we go to a dinner party and we didn't know people, my wife would, I would always tell her, don't out me, let it come out in the due course of things, because everybody wants to say he's a cop, he's a cop. Like,
Yeah.
it's so funny. But I appreciate it though, because they're proud, right?
Mm.
And the biggest piece of feedback I always got was, oh my God, you're a cop.
Mm.
You're not what I expected. Because
Mm.
people expect this, sort of deadpan expression, emotionless robot that is just out to arrest everybody and give everybody tickets and be, not be emotionally invested in things. And we're completely the opposite.
Mhm.
And so, I would talk to people about, issues, and like, you can't be afraid to take on the hard stuff, because
Mhm.
sometimes you got to look at the mirror and say, maybe we've been doing something wrong here. Uh, and have that conversation, because if we don't have the conversation, we can't move forward, right? So I would say, get to know us. uh, there's all kinds of different ways that you can engage with us, whether it's our neighborhood officers, our CPLCs, our consultative committees, or just stopping and talking to an officer who's in your neighborhood, driving by. Wave, hey, how are you? How are you? Great. What are you up to? I'm just driving around. Anything going on? No, I'm just going to work, whatever. And have those real conversations. And you'll find that we definitely appreciate those. Even if you don't love us, even if you don't agree with us, that's fine. We can have differing opinions, but still, connect as humans and as people, sort of going about our daily lives, even
Mhm.
if we don't agree. So I think it's just really important to get to know us. And I think that's why I think thank you for the work you're doing here with these,
Mm.
because I think this is kind of like an extension of people getting to know us a little bit, like seeing us have a conversation and what we believe in and where we came from, and where we're going. I think it's just so important for people to see us,
Mhm.
for us as people. So we talked about the dehumanizing. It goes the other way. As soon as uniform goes on, you get dehumanized in a lot of ways, and I don't blame people for that. But let's just try to break that down a little bit and reconnect a little. So I think it's so important to get to know us, because
Mhm.
I've seen over and over again, people change their minds and they
Mhm.
say, "Wow, that's not what I expected."
Mhm.
And I'm glad, I'm so happy every time I hear that, because that's, as you do something wrong, it travels exponentially.
Mhm.
And but you do something right, maybe that person, people around them might know. So it's so important to keep these bridges being built. So I think that that's really what I want to get out of this,
I,
is just
I
people getting to know us.
I feel like so many members of the media could relate to what you're saying. Ironically, because I know that a lot of police officers, I wish the media would do more positive, like tell more of our positive stories. But as a former member of the media, and I mean, to a large extent, I'm still very involved in the media. When I would have a member of the public, because some members of the public, many members just don't like the media for whatever reason. When I would have somebody come up to me and say something nice, like, how are you today? Or I hope you have a great day. I would be like, thank you so much. Like, nobody has said that to me in so long. So yeah, go and say hello to your local officer, ask them how they're doing, just have, chit chat. And of course, if you see Inspector Stefan Prentice, he probably won't be wearing this golf shirt. He's at I should mention that you're at the cottage right now. You're doing this on your own time. He'd probably be wearing his white inspector shirt. Go and you'll probably be greeted with that same smile that I'm seeing right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Always up for a great conversation with somebody in the community. So yeah, 100%. Come on up and we'll talk. And you never know where the conversation is going to lead, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Inspector. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tamara.